After I released my What If Robert Kennedy Survived video, a few people in the comments asked me to do a 1972 election night. So I might do that, but I'm not sure if I will do it in the future. I'm basically just going to kind of skip that step and just do the entire timeline in one video. So if you haven't seen my What If Robert Kennedy Survived video, I would recommend you check it out now and then come back and watch this video. So this is the map. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't seen it, but this is the map. Again, still watch election night. It's pretty good. I worked hard on it. Anyway, if Robert Kennedy survived, he beats Richard Nixon in 1968. I did not include George Wallace in the scenario just for simplicity, as some of you asked in the comments. Anyway, so if we go to 1972, I think that Kennedy's challenger would be George Romney. If you know the Romney name, it's definitely because of Mitt Romney, who is a modern-day politician, but back in the 70s and 60s, George Romney was the governor of Michigan, and he's also Mitt Romney's dad, interestingly enough. Anyway, Nixon won by a pretty large margin in 1972, and I think Kennedy could win by another decently large margin. I would assume Kennedy is pretty popular in this scenario, so that's why it gets around like 496 electoral votes, a pretty large margin. Nixon got higher, so I think it's definitely possible for Kennedy to do well, especially since George Romney wasn't a great politician. He pretty much blew his chance to be the nominee for the Republicans in 1968. So he'd make a few gaffes. That's kind of what he did, and that's why he's not very well known today. Anyway, going on to 1976, we have John Connally versus Ronald Reagan. So John Connally, I mentioned this in the election night, would be Robert Kennedy's vice president because he's a pretty well-known Southern Democrat. He was governor of Texas, so he'd be very good for balancing out the ticket. And if he was vice president in the Kennedy administration, he'd probably be the nominee in 1976. I'd imagine he'd face a more liberal challenger, though. Anyway, so even if Kennedy was popular in 1976, you have Ronald Reagan. So Reagan was pretty popular around the country. He was well known for being an actor. And John Connally was very, very conservative. He's like one of the last remaining Southern Democrats in this timeline, and even in our timeline, he actually switched to the Republican Party, and I think he ran for president under that title. So, anyway, I think Reagan will win this one by a pretty handy margin. Now, going to 1980, 1980, I believe there were some economic troubles, and Jimmy Carter got a few of them under control, but really it was the fact that he was against such a good candidate as Reagan and was really bad at handling crises. So that's why Carter lost by a large margin. So Reagan would do better at that. So he wouldn't win in a landslide against George McGovern, who I picked for the nomination for the Democrats because he's more liberal than Connally was. When the Democrats would switch up and go for a liberal Democrat after that. Anyway, Reagan wins by a lesser margin than he did in 1980 because there would be some economic downturn, but McGovern would be pretty controversial as a very, very progressive figure, so he wouldn't get a ton of the votes. Anyway, in 1984, I think Birch Bayh, who would be the senator of Indiana in this scenario, would win over Bob Dole. I put him as Robert Dole, that's his real name. Anyway, Birch Bayh was definitely a pretty liberal figure. His son was the former senator from Indiana. His name is Evan Bayh. He was in my 2022 Senate election night, so you can watch that as well. I'm going to stop plugging my videos from now on. Anyway, Birch Bayh was definitely around the same place as Robert Kennedy. He was pretty close to the Kennedy family. And imagine this timeline, RFK would endorse him, and after 8 years of Reagan, I can imagine the country would switch up to go to a Democrat. Anyway, so now we head over to 1988. We have Birch Bayh again going up against Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp was a former football player and representative from New York. He's a pretty interesting figure ideology-wise. He was kind of a libertarian, but he's very conservative. So I can definitely see Birch Bayh improving a lot, getting more electoral votes than he did in 1984. So you can see he went from 324 electoral votes to 346. He wins Nevada, South Dakota, and Georgia. Actually, in 1988, I believe South Dakota was pretty close, and I believe that Birch Bayh, who was kind of a left-wing populist, and he could appeal to blue-collar voters like he did in Indiana, he could win that state. So then we head over to 1992, and we have Jesse Jackson versus Colin Powell. So kind of like after 8 years of Reagan, after 8 years of Bayh, I believe the country would switch up, and the Democrats nominated someone like Jesse Jackson, who was a very liberal figure. And I think he would kind of shift the Democratic base. For example, in this timeline, the Democrats with Kennedy had a very good coalition of blue-collar voters and minority voters. and they combined that into wins, and that's how they won. That's how they won elections like 1968 and 1984. But with Jackson and Connolly, they only had essentially one of those demographics. So that's why Jesse Jackson loses against Colin Powell, who is he's a well-known general who was Secretary of State in our timeline in the Bush administration, Bush 43, I believe, before Obama. Anyway, he wouldn't be Secretary of State in this timeline, but he would be very well known. And with Jesse Jackson being a pretty liberal figure, he definitely won by a large margin. And in 1996, I believe that the Democrats would kind of overcompensate for Jesse Jackson and pick a very centrist figure, and that'd be Al Gore. And Al Gore would not do very well at all. He'd lose his home state of Tennessee, Washington, much of the Northeast, and only win a few states. Colin Powell would improve it on his margin, going from 461 electoral votes to 482 electoral votes. And now we go to 2000, and yet again, continuing the trend, Paul Wellstone, who in our time actually unfortunately died of a plane crash, would be the Democratic nominee, and he wins over John McCain. So he wins with coalition, very similar to Birch Bayh. He's another Rust Belt politician. He's a senator from Minnesota. So he'd do well in the Midwest, the Northeast, and he'd do well in the West, but Oregon would go to John McCain since Paul Wellstone is a progressive, and McCain would appeal more to the suburban moderate voters in Oregon. In 2004, Paul Wellstone also wins by a large margin over Lincoln Chafee, who was a pretty meh figure, and their GOP did not put up a good candidate in this election, hence Paul Wellstone wins by a large margin. And then we have Jeb Bush versus John Edwards. So this one, I had to say kind of a controversial opinion. I think the 2000s financial crash would not be as bad in this timeline since Paul Wellstone would likely institute more strict regulations. And if that was a cause or not, I believe that in the end, I'm not going to really have that have as much of an effect. But anyway, I have Jeb Bush against John Edwards, and John Edwards in this timeline would actually have a few scandals after he was nominee. He'd probably beat out Bill Clinton or maybe another liberal politician, maybe Sherrod Brown, for example, or Dennis Kucinich. Anyway, I believe in our timeline, Edwards had a scandal. I want to say it's an affair, I'm not sure. But in this timeline, this happens after he's a nominee, and a lot of Democrats go to Jeb Bush, who campaigns as a moderate, uniting figure, and that allows him to win states like New Jersey, New Hampshire, a lot of the Democratic stronghold. If you look at the two comparisons, you see Wellstone doing very well in this Midwestern area, and Edwards losing a lot of it. Anyway, let's move on to 2012, and in 2012, it'd be Bill Clinton versus Jeb Bush. Bill Clinton gets a very interesting coalition. He basically gets some of the southern states like Louisiana and Arkansas, and takes a little bit of the Wellstone Midwestern coalition back. But in the end, Jeb Bush in this timeline is very popular, so he wins this election. And now we head on to 2016. So in 2016, Joe Kennedy III, who just barely beat 35, would run against Ted Cruz. So Ted Cruz in this timeline would be more of kind of what Donald Trump was. He would be pretty anti-establishment, really bucking the trends. He's kind of like a Jack Kemp figure. And he would basically get the dissatisfaction with the GOP establishment that has been essentially building since many of the GOP nominees in this timeline have been very centrist, and he'd use that to win the nomination. But then you have Joe Kennedy III, who's part of the Kennedy dynasty, essentially, and the Kennedys are remembered pretty fondly in this timeline because RFK was very popular, so that would mean that Kennedy wins by a large margin. And then we go to 2020, this is the final election. Joe Kennedy III wins by another large margin, as you can see, against Mitt Romney. He's pretty popular, so he wins states like Georgia, Florida, takes back the Wellstone Midwestern coalition, as you can see. Here are a few interesting shifts from our timeline to this timeline that I'll point out at the end of the video. As you can see, states like Missouri, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia all stay in the Democratic column because of their strength of blue-collar voters. Virginia never flips to the Democrats, along with Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. There aren't many other flips besides that. Maine 2nd District is more Democratic in this timeline. Basically, the major changes, and I guess this is, if you skip the end, which I wouldn't recommend doing because I went through a bunch of elections. So if you did that, go back and watch it. Anyway, the changes essentially in our timeline to this timeline was that the Democrats essentially shifted they merged both of their coalitions. So you had the minority coalition and the blue collar voter coalition, and that essentially, I believe, was Barack Obama's. That's basically the groups he won on in 2008. So essentially, they have that, and that allows the Democrats to win by pretty large margins. Meanwhile, the GOP stays more centrist and moderate, so that allows them to win in places like Virginia, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, for example. And Democrats, because of their coalition, allows them to win in the lower Midwest and lower Rust Belt, like Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri. And the Republican victories come from usually more popular figures, essentially. There aren't really ideologies. For example, Reagan was just a very well-known figure, and that allowed him to win his election back in the 70s and 80s. The people who lost were like Bob Dole and Jack Kemp were pretty conservative, so that didn't help them. But you had Colin Powell, very popular, he won. And then you also had Jeb Bush, and I think Jeb Bush in this time, I guess, would be more well-liked, but his father wasn't a politician, or wasn't the president at least. He'd definitely still be a politician. So that kind of helped him. But yeah, only one Bush in this timeline. So there you have it. Thank you if you stayed through this whole video. It was actually pretty fun to make. I had to sit around making all these tabs, but I actually enjoyed that. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe, which you can see on the right of your screen right now. Check out my other videos, and there will be one tailored to your interest provided by YouTube on the left. So you can watch that and watch more of my videos. You can also, before you do that, leave a comment telling me what you thought of this video, or any suggestions or changes to the timeline, and telling me how absurd it is that Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia become pretty solid, or not solid Democratic states, but Democratic-leaning swing states. Anyway, all that'd be appreciated. Hit the notification bell after you subscribe, and that'll be all. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time.